perhaps no American knows the story of the Beatles in America better than veteran journalist Larry Kane. He is the only American reporter to accompany the Fab Four on every stop of both their 64 and 65 tours. He's written 3 books about the Beatles, the most recent being When They Were Boys, the story of the Beatles' early years before they were superstars. Larry, thank you so much for joining us.
Bill, great to talk to you again.
50 years. Can you believe it's been 50 years since their first concert?
There's 2 levels of that. Number one, it's kind of amazing because Brian Epstein said to me in 1964, the Beatles will be around, Larry, and talking and singing to the children of the 21st century, which, of course, was hard to believe. And the second thing was that I'm 50 years older.
Yes. How old were you in 64?
I was 21.
Bless your heart. All right, now, you did not get to attend the 64 concert here in D.C. yourself, but you've been told, I mean, obviously, you're traveling with the Beatles. They're telling you, I'm sure, lots of stories about it.
Well, there's one very fascinating aspect of that concert that a lot of people don't realize. The most fascinating aspect was that 8,000 people were there. And prior to coming to America for this little mini arrival, primarily for the Ed Sullivan shows, and this was a hastily arranged concert in Washington, they had never performed before more than 400 or 500 people at a time at the most, except for the Royal Concert in London. So basically, this crowd, the Washington crowd, was the biggest thing they'd ever seen. And of course, as usual, there wasn't enough security there. They had people from the service trying to help them out. They also had a situation where the stage, they had to move around the stage. They didn't have the proper equipment. But nevertheless, when they came to Washington, that was their first gigantic concert of their lives. And it was pretty amazing to them.
Now, do I understand that they came here largely because of disc jockey Carroll James?
Well, that's part of the story. Nobody's really confirmed that, but Carroll James, as you know, was the person who is said to have played I Want to Hold Your Hand for the first time, way before December 26th. When it was released to the rest of the world, 1963, and it was all about a request from a fan, and I think the station was WWDC, and it was certainly a major event for the Beatles, although very few people really knew about it nationwide until years later.
And I like history and the way things fit together in history. We have to keep in mind this was just a few weeks after we lost an American president, and the country was plunged into a deep period of mourning and sorrow and despair, and all of a sudden here comes these 4 guys, happy-go-lucky, they're smiling, they have happy tunes. How did that transform America?
I think it helped America a lot. In 2002, when I wrote Ticket to Ride, I talked about that symbiotic relationship there, and most of the self-styled intellectuals of the nation put me down for it. And they said, well, what do you mean? How do you know there was a connection? Well, I know there was a connection because I lived it. And the president's assassination was a very dark time in American history. People were really down emotionally. And the Beatles came along, and obviously they weren't designed to be a tonic for this, but they certainly were because it took our eyes off of it for a little bit. And although I must say, and I want to make this very clear to everybody listening, the Beatles in 1963, 64, 65, on through 1970 were not the Beatles we know today. And by that, I mean that, yes, the first aspect of their arrival in the world was their fandom, this electric, frenzied, women pulling their hair out, staring so much, thinking each one of them was singing to them, this sense of camaraderie with them and love and passion. That was the first part of the Beatles. The second part was the realization that their music was intense, exciting, and varied. And the third part didn't come until many years later in the 1980s when people started putting 2 and 2 together and realized they had the greatest collection of music in the history of recorded music. So in those days, in the aftermath of the assassination of the president, and when I traveled with them extensively, it was big, it was huge, it was giant. I mean, there wasn't anything mega like it before, but nobody really knew they would become the icons they've become today.
Well, I gather when you talk about the legions of screaming girls, I wonder how many people at that Washington concert that night in February of 64 actually heard any of the songs.
Well, actually, that was one of the better concerts. And if you look at some of the bootleg material from that, you can actually see they were being heard because there was a distance between them and the audience from the stand there, the bandstand they set up. There weren't many places they could be heard, but I figured out a way to do it with my ears. I had to cup my ears a certain way, and I want to tell you something about. I attended some of them 2 or 3 in one city, 74 Beatles concerts, and I will tell you that they sounded exactly like the record. So basically what I'm saying to you is they were a great band, and they were tight. If you look at Sullivan, the first show of Sullivan was all live, 2 sets. The second show was live from Miami Beach, which I saw at the Deauville Hotel. The third show was recorded in the first show, but 2 of them were just live. I mean, then you look at that, not doctored, not engineered in any way, and that group was as perfect as you can get.
Now, I want to talk about your new book, When They Were Boys. I gather you hadn't planned on writing a third book about the Beatles?
No, actually, my wife was going to probably leave the house if I did another book. But I never planned it. But then I got really fascinated, and I started to find out something. That there's a lot I didn't know about them, and there was a lot written about them that was dictated by them. It was their story. And the independent story, what really happened to them, was never really told. There are sections of it, they're gigantic books, they're small books, but nobody ever told it in the way that I write. And basically, I found out some unbelievable things. First of all, it was a 7-year march to greatness, not a year or two. Secondly, John Lennon's really was the founder, the heart and soul of the band. And the way he started was a story that you and I could not make up. We could sit there and try to make it up. You couldn't make it up. He brings Paul McCartney to the band after his classmates leave the band. They start working with George Harrison in a coffee house called the Jacaranda, where they're cleaning bathrooms at night and painting bathrooms and doing anything to get noticed. They do a few little concerts here and there, the most notable of which is backup playing for a woman named Janice the Stripper. That was their first cover band activity. They then went to Hamburg with the same guy who owned the coffee shop, and they lived in a bathroom. They worked 18 hours a day. They were beaten up by nightclub goons who wanted them to work later and later. They enlisted the help, not financially but as a friend, of a convicted killer to protect them. Okay, they were so sick from their relationships with women who were working women, that not the kind of working women that we know and admire here, that they had to get penicillin shots every 3 days. They were pushed out of Hamburg, and everybody talks about Hamburg as being some sort of really glorious time for them. It was not. It was actually a time when they were really in between the concept of working late teenagers and abused teenagers. They were treated very badly. 2 of them were Paul and Pete Best, their great first drummer, were accused of setting a fire in a nightclub stage. George Harrison was deported from the country. He was so embarrassed. John Lennon was accused of stealing a harmonica from a music shop, which he did. And they had this incredibly difficult, tortuous experience there, but they did play well every day. Got back from there, wanted to quit, and a little concert sort of revived them at the end of December 1960. If you look at the times in this story, the betrayal, the love, the success, the glory, the people who were left behind, the 20 or so people who still get together every few weeks in this day and celebrate their birthdays, the people who made them really helped make them what they were, the forgotten people. It's quite a story of drama, and it takes place in a gritty town with religious differences and racial tension and anti-Semitism and a real tough post-war period. And these guys did something that was unbelievable. They came out of this from this very prejudicial background. 2 of the families told them not to sign with Brian Epstein because you don't want to deal with a Jewish businessman. Okay? And they overcame all this, and they did 2 very dramatic things that no one knows about today. They got the first black group, a guy named Joe Anker and the Chants, C-H-A-N-T-S, an a cappella doo-wop group, and put them in the cavern for the first time. As teenagers, they did that. They broke the most extraordinary racial barrier. And then later in the United States, in Las Vegas, I told them the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville was going to be segregated, and they refused to play. And because of their tenacity, 2.5 weeks later, the Jacksonville Gator Bowl and all the stadiums in the southern part of the United States were suddenly integrated. So, I mean, it's a story of rags to riches. They really weren't in rags except for Ringo. The rest were middle income.
I was going to say, it's a jaw-dropping contrast to the kind of mythical overnight success story that we all think we know.
There wasn't any overnight success.
That's what I mean.
And here's the other interesting part. all those songs that we heard, or maybe you're probably too young for that, but all those songs we heard in 1964 that were cascaded week after week, and people would say, how can they keep producing these songs? How can they do this? Well, the fact is, they were, John and Paul, and to a lesser extent, but a significant extent, George, were writing these songs as early as 1962. And so Americans would not play the songs. American distributors did not want to touch them. And finally, when they did release them, they had so many songs stored up that by the April, I think the first week of April, 1964, they were, without a question, had 5 of the top 10 songs on the Billboard charts in America. And here's another thing people don't know, that they were so incredibly mature for people that age. And yeah, you know, the night stuff happened, and I was there, and there were a lot of women, and all of them were over the appropriate age, and 3 of the Beatles were single. And I'm not going to get into that, but one of them was married, and he didn't really care at the time. But what I will tell you is that on the tour, they exhibited behaviors that were some behaviors that 40 or 50-year-olds couldn't have. For example, their opening acts of their 1964 tour, Jackie DeShannon, who was the Katy Perry of her day, the Righteous Brothers, Bill Black Combo, the Exciters, one of the first partially all-black girl groups in America. They were all drowned out by the crowds. We Want the Beatles. These were distinguished musical acts in their own time. And every night they would get on the plane, and after they freshened up, they have a cigarette or a drink, they would walk to the front, and they would make sure these guys were okay.
Wow.
And they were just very mature people.
Wow. And can you imagine a concert goer in those years buy a ticket for that for $2 or $3 or $4?
Well, I'm looking at the prices actually recently, and the top price for the 64-65 tour was $4.95. and I believe the ticket in Washington, pretty easy to look it up, was about $3. And so, but remember, inflation carries the day. So $3.50 or $4 was a lot of money.
The new book called When They Were Boys, The True Story of the Beatles' Rise to the Top. Larry Kane, thank you so much for joining us.